Okay, so a little bit about myself and aiEDU. So I work for a nonprofit. We work with K-12 systems across the country. We train about 20,000 teachers a year, a school year. And all of our work is really centered around this idea of AI is really putting a lot of pressure on the way that we prepare young people for the future. It's really difficult to actually imagine what kinds of futures that like a first grader is going to be growing up to into in 11 or 12 years. And so the kinds of skills that we develop back down to first grade all the way through high school are really quickly coming into focus, and they're really quickly getting at, we're asking pretty pervasively, like, what are actually the skills that we need students to have? And so the work that we do is oftentimes it sits in like the strategic layer. It sits on the like how do we think about teaching and learning techniques and practices? How do we think about learning standards and how those should be shifting? That's the kind of work that we do with K-12 systems. So we work with hundreds of school districts, about 12 states in the country, to really help answer a lot of these questions. A lot of the way that we think about AI readiness really anchors on this key human skill differentiation of what we sometimes refer to as like the human advantage. Right now, we think of AI readiness as like, yes, we need subject matter expertise. We need people who know the basics of whatever they want to, of whatever passion they want to chase. I want to go into computer science. Yes, AI can code, but you still need to understand the basics of computer science and software engineering. But you also need to apply this like critical thinking layer, and you also need to understand where and how to leverage my human-centered skills in this world in which AI is quite dis is like a big disruptor in the skills market, so to speak. Um, Personally, my background, I taught for about 8 years, and then I went into the research space via the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford. And this is kind of where I started to hone a lot of my thinking. A former colleague at Stanford released a paper called Canaries in the Coal Mine. Eric Brynjolfsson, he's like a economist, and his research really shows a couple of trends that we've seen a couple of times in our history. One, since the release of ChatGPT, we've seen this chart specifically tracks the S&P 500, but generally economic growth at a rate that we hadn't quite seen in the past, but at the same time, a drop in job openings. And you can like this chart kind of shows that divergence of what the workforce is experiencing in terms of the worker economy versus the financial economy and how that's actually performing. And specifically, we're seeing the hardest hit a group of folks are young recent graduates. They're at the highest rate of unemployment and underemployment in our country right now. And Brynjolfsson talks about how we actually see this trend quite regularly in the US economy. Every time there's a kind of an arrival technology that really shifts the workforce. We've seen this with the dot-com boom. We've seen this with offshoring post 2008. And so this is like AI is kind of working itself into this trend that the US economy has kind of gone into in the past. And so the big question that this kind of drives for me as someone whose like background is primarily in K-12 education is like, what do we actually have to teach? Like, what kinds of skills are more important now? Should we still be teaching kids how to write essays? Like, should we still te be teaching kids how to do calculations if technology can just do all of this for us? And these are just really kind of scary questions that a lot of classroom teachers are experiencing now. The tension that I feel in my job right now is that the workforce, the economy is actually shifting very, very quickly. Meanwhile, education structures and education systems cannot pivot. Like they're not built to change very rapidly. They're built to teach for the the next 2, 3 generations. They're not built to address the immediate need of the next 2, 3 years of the economy. And so we have to kind of get out of as a K-12 system, we have to get out of this like this uh, fray almost of um, skills transformation, workforce transformation. The capacities of technology is changing so rapidly. We cannot pivot and like and trying to address every single one of these changes, but we have to try and zoom out of and look at the big picture and like what are the actual skills that the K-12 system should be anchoring on. Um, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit. My organization partnered with the Burning Glass Institute. If you're unfamiliar, the Burning Glass Institute is essentially a huge, almost like data broker. They have one of the biggest data sets of job postings data in the country. And so we're looking at specifically one of the key data points that we're looking at is jobs postings data, which is differentiated from, for example, performance data. Um, but let me try and describe a little bit about the work that I do. And this is kind of the portion which I nerd out. I'm going to try and communicate relatively effectively. But the goal of this research was to kind of connect the like economics research and workforce research with K-12 research, because oftentimes those two worlds are actually very different from each other, and they're extremely connected. The kinds of skills that K-12 systems are developing are is extremely important for the way that the economy is shifting. And so what we did was we took all 54 school systems in the country. We took their graduation requirements. So the requirements that every state has for graduation in out of high school systems. We took all of those learning objectives from graduation requirements, and we took on the workforce side, we took job postings data, and we looked at workforce skills that were reflected in job postings data. And we essentially created a list of intermediating skills that we saw reflected across different things. This is quite difficult to do, partly because you find like learning objectives are not actually skills or competencies based. They're rather broad subject areas. And so usually multiple skills can come out of learning objectives. Meanwhile, workforce skills tend to be actually quite specific, and so the workforce skills tend to be a little bit more targeted in the way that they're written. So these are like two very different data sets that we had to work with, and leveraging the in the research world. We kind of joke and we talk about the traditional AI is actually just grad students and their time, the ability for them to kind of go through a bunch of data and help make sure that the data is actually useful. Um, so what we found, like when doing this, is that we took all of these intermediate skills and essentially gave them a score on two axes. The first axis is how much is the skill likely to be automated in the workforce. The second axis is how much is the skill likely to get augmented in the workforce. So each skill essentially got an augmentation and an automation, I guess, score or a number, which allowed us to kind of plot all of these intermediate skills and like essentially conduct an analysis and create frameworks around this. So you'll find that we kind of ended up having four different frameworks across or four different um, quadrants across all of these skills, and we tried to think about thematic ways that education systems should address these skills being taught in the K-12 system based off where these skills landed on this plot. So you find that things like grammar, like the skills of grammar and spelling and syntax, have a pretty high, like 80% of those skills that we find in K-12 graduation requirements. Those are very likely to get automated. I actually don't need to be an amazing speller in order to write nowadays. Like that's a pretty automated process. Versus abstractive reasoning, like that's not something that's going to be automated at all. It's actually very low on the automation scale, but still quite high on the augmentation scale because I can use AI, I can use technology to help coalesce data in a new way that I never had before. And so my ability to abstract reasoning across different subject matter areas is actually quite augmentable, but not very automatable. And so like these are kind of the ways that we looked at every single one of these skills. Um, and essentially, the four quadrants that we kind of came up with try and capture the themes of each of the skills that fall here. We have an anchor quadrant, which in which like these are extremely human skills. They're actually not going to be automated nor augmented. These are actually what we think of as like the AI proof skills. These are going to be things like your communication skills, your creativity skills. Actually, creativity I think is a little bit more augmentable. But these are skills that we thought would be a little bit more human, so to speak. We thought of the streamline skills, which have a very high rate of automation, like spelling. These are things that are likely going to be streamlined and maybe don't need to be assessed as heavily as it is today in the K-12 system. We have Deepen skills. So these are skills that actually we think are going to be giving young people the most economic mobility in their futures because they're highly augmentable, but they're actually not very likely to get automated. And so these are actually the skills that will likely give people, employability, so to speak, or give them a lot of economic mobility if they've developed these skills deeply. And then we have the transform skills. These are the skills that are likely going to be completely transformed in the workforce and in the K-12 system because they're so likely to get automated and augmented at the same time. So these are really things like data analysis, for example. Like a lot of portions of data analysis are getting augmented, and a lot of portions of data analysis are getting augmented. And the way that we're seeing data analysis jobs shift is like extremely rapid. And so the way that we think about teaching data sciences or data analysis in the K-12 system should actually transform pretty greatly. Okay, so out of like after looking at all of these skills and looking at all of this data, we kind of found three general truths that we thought to be true. One was that the cognitive bar is raising for young people. Essentially, the like my ability to just write an essay and submit that essay to a teacher, like that's not quite enough anymore. I actually have to deepen my thought around the essay. Can I argue against my own essay? Can I present my thinking? Am I able to critically evaluate other people's essays? The cognitive bar is raising pretty greatly because we actually want to get into this anchor and this deepen spaces a lot more rapidly with young people, which means the ability to critically think and to evaluate and to communicate. Like these are things that actually need to happen more frequently in K-12 systems, but it also means the cognitive bar is raising. Another key insight that we got was that a lot of times the divide of these skills runs within subject matter areas, not kind of between them. Meaning, we don't think this means that all of ELA teaching is going to become obsolete. There are going to be some skills within ELA teaching that might become obsolete or might need to shift really rapidly, but there are some skills within ELA subject matter areas that actually need to be focused on a little bit more. You learn how to spell, but you also learn how to critically think in English language arts classes. And so you can't just like take an entire subject matter area and say it doesn't matter anymore. This particular talking point, I think, speaks greatly to the computer science field right now. I think a lot of folks in computer science are quite anxious about the way that AI is shifting computer science skills in the workforce. But you still find that computer science teaches some really necessary things in the workforce: computational thinking, data analysis, the ability to understand systems thinking. Like those are actually very important skills in the future, and they're being taught in computer science pathways. And so it's not about just like completely writing off one specific pathway or one specific subject. And then the third thing is that the final product is no longer a reliable signal. The way that we assess students is actually needs to change a lot. A lot of times in K-12 systems, the way that students are assessed is I give you a final product and I'm graded on that final product, and that's the end, and we move on to the next skill. That's not quite enough. Like the polished essay, the final math test, um, I know the multiple choice quiz I took in history, that isn't actually a very good reflection or a very good way to assess human skill. We find that things like project-based learning, like giving kids a real problem to build solutions for, we find that giving students the opportunity to collaborate with other humans is actually very, very important in how they solve those problems. And that's not necessarily a product-based approach to assessment. That's going to be like a very process-based approach to assessment. How did you think about this problem? What kinds of solutions did you think about? Why did you choose this and why didn't you choose that? Like those kinds of metacognitive skills and process-based assessments are so important right now. And so like in K-12 context, we try and think about, okay, like if I'm a teacher and I have like teachers still, the standards are the same. Standards have not changed in the past since ChatGPT has come around. And so as a teacher, I'm still required to teach towards my learning standards that I'm required to teach against. Here, this is an ELA learning standard. Like you have to write arguments and support claims with clear reasons and relevant evidence. Like standards are quite broad. I'm not like I can actually like approach this skill building in a lot of different ways. And so we're not saying that necessarily teachers need to add new kinds of new standards or new learning objectives to their work. We just have to rethink the way that we approach current learning objectives. Maybe I anchor on the intellectual core of this learning objective, and maybe I can kind of just streamline the writing process. Like I'm not going to assess students necessarily on only the writing. That can be a little bit more streamlined, but I want to assess their judgment. I want to assess the way that they worked towards this project, the workflow that they approached. If they use AI, why? How? Focus on the energy of like shaping and critiquing the kind of final product rather than the final product itself. And so that we kind of have an entire framework of how to adjust or think about learning standards within all of these skills, all of the intermediary skills that we've outlined, and essentially teaching techniques or educational techniques that we would recommend for every single learning standard across ELA, the next generation science standards, the Common Core standards. And so this is kind of the way that we've used research to inform the way that we train teachers. If we're going to be in front of more than 20,000 teachers a year, we need to have a pretty good anchor point of what are the recommendations that we're giving teachers and how do we actually prepare students for that future. Balancing instruction is really, really important here because teachers have already kind of are overloaded with with the kinds of requirements that are put upon them. And so there's this weird thing that's happening in education where we're finding that AI has the potential to like lower teachers' load, it saves teachers time, but it's also raising the demand of what teachers have to do in the classroom. And this is actually quite an anxiety-driven conversation with a lot of teachers right now because their jobs, their day-to-day jobs are transforming quite rapidly. And so naming this explicitly and giving them specific techniques to work towards solution building is a very key point that aiEDU is trying to address right now. And specifically in assessments, I talked about this a little bit, but again, like product-based assessment is probably needs to die. Process-based assessment is actually something that we need to move towards. The problem is it's actually really difficult to do process-based assessment at scale. The standardized test and the Scantrons, like those things are really easy to scale rapidly across millions, tens of millions of students in a country. Assessing processes is actually quite difficult to do. And so I think this is a really big undertaking that the K-12 system has to consider. We're also suggesting that a lot of teachers right now are thinking about like how do I detect AI use? How do I make sure my students don't use AI? And honestly, we try and shift the conversation around away from detection as a solution here and thoughtful design of assignments. Like you can actually design tasks where AI use could be expected or it could be warranted, but it actually isn't going to change the way that you assess because you want quality of direction and judgment and critique, and AI isn't necessarily going to change that. And so whether a student uses AI or not, the assessment still stands true. And then the idea that written and take-home work is honestly, we're starting to see that die a little bit more, especially in college courses. When I talk to educators, they're leaning a little bit more towards like project-based assignments, making sure that oral defenses are actually a common practice more. Think alouds, give students the opportunity to collaborate with other students, like give them other ways to demonstrate skills that isn't just some sort of like written piece of paper that I turn into a teacher. And outside of my work with aiEDU, I also do a lot of mentoring for young people transitioning from high school into college. And honestly, they're feeling a lot of anxiety about like what major do I choose? What career pathways should I pursue? And they're just in this kind of state of like, just tell me what to do. Like I don't know how to make sense of the really quickly shifting field of the economy and the workforce and like technology. Like I just don't know where it's going. Like the through line through all of this is like one, just do something hard, challenge yourself, like figure out what you're passionate about and pursue that passion, even if it's quite difficult. And honestly, we're at a stage right now where you don't just, the learner in you doesn't die after you graduate, after you get your degree. The learner in you needs to be continuously alive and well. You need to be learning constantly and dealing with people as much as you can, understanding how to work within teams, how to actually argue or disagree with someone and resolve that, how to critique people in a way that feels supportive. Like those kinds of skills are so human and so necessary, even in all of the automated workforce conversations that are happening right now. These are still the innately human things that we think we still want young people to invest in.